Working in levels and curves in Photoshop can be a little bit confusing because, to be honest, the amount of adjustments you can make is almost infinite. Now, we're going to show you quickly, if we have a look at this image here, this was actually taken from the hot air balloon in Bournemouth. And it was not a hazy day, but you can see the light isn't fantastic, but the image looks fairly bland. You know, you can see the shaded areas are fairly grey. Overall, it hasn't got much punch to it. So to add more contrast to an image, we use levels and curves, and it's something I do with pretty much all of my images. Now, if we go to Image Adjustments and we start with Levels, you can either use Control L or go through the menu system. That will bring up the tonal curve, the histogram of the image. Now, you've got three sections here. You've got the shaded areas, the midtones and the highlights. If there's a big gap here, it means the image in some parts is underexposed. If you've got a gap here, it means some parts are overexposed, and then you can play about the sliders. But what I generally tend to do is bring the darker areas, the shaded areas, down a tad to add some contrast, so you can see the adjustments it's making there. Now, I either bring it to the base of the first mountain, if you like, just here. I bring the slider just to there, just to add a touch. Some people say bring it to the actual peak of the first mountain, if you like, the peak there, and that will add a lot more contrast to the image. So it's kind of taste, but I'd say anywhere in between those two sections is pretty good for adding contrast. Let's leave it about there for now. Now, on this one, I would normally add the highlights as well, but if we do that, you can see this area up here is becoming overblown. Now, if you do have just a flat area here like this, then you can bring the highlights over and it will just add bring some, again, a bit more punch to the image and increase the highlights without blowing them out. Now, if you still want to increase the highlights without touching this area, there is a quick trick you can do. So if we click OK with that for now, we'll leave the contrast as it is. Then if you go to Select, Color Range, Highlights, we've selected the highlights, and if we now select Inverse and then feather that by around 20 pixels, we've now selected everything other than the highlights. So now if we go to Image Adjustment Levels, you can see we have got that gap. So we can bring up the highlights of the rest of the image without touching the actual or blowing out the highlights that are already there. So we'll just bring that over to there to bring up the highlights again. Click OK, unselect everything, and you can see already we made quite a difference. If we revert that back to how it was, you can see we've added a bit of punch to it. So already the levels have made quite a good difference. Now we're going to work on the curves. So if we go to Adjustments, Curves, or Control M, you'll now bring up the curve. So it's a similar histogram. You can see it's the same kind of shape, and it still works on the shadows, midtones, and highlights. So again, most people work on what's called an S-curve. If we take the darker areas, the shaded areas, and bring the curve down, we're actually adding more contrast to it. If we take it up, we're decreasing the contrast in the shaded areas. Okay, you have to be quite careful with this. So depending on your own personal preferences, you can adjust that how you like. So you can maybe bring up the shaded areas and tone down the highlights that way, or you can go the other way and increase the highlights slightly and bring down the shadows a little bit more, just to increase the shadows and the contrast. So you can see we've got a very slight S-curve there. So let's leave it at that and click OK, and then we're going to revert back again to show the difference now between the original and after working on levels and curves. So you can see it's just added a bit of punch. We've still got all the detail here in the shaded areas, but we are just adding a bit of punch and a bit of contrast to the image. So that's really the basic way to use the levels and curves. As soon as you open an image after you've perhaps processed it from RAW or from a JPEG straight from the camera, the first thing I would do is just check the levels and then possibly add some curves adjustments as well.